So today we're diving into something really quite fascinating, a totally scientific, almost radical reinterpretation of a massive core concept. We're talking about Paticca Samuppada in Buddhism, or, as it's more widely known, dependent origination. We'll be basing this on the incredibly detailed writings of Parakrama Wira, and what we're going to explore is a framework that literally shifts this ancient teaching away from a mystical, metaphysical concept and turns it into a strictly biological, scientific one. It's a bold analytical approach, and it absolutely challenges centuries of commentary. I literally can't wait to unpack exactly how this perspective works. Let's get right into it. We're actually going to skip the usual agenda today because I want to jump straight into a massive question that the source text puts right front and center. Ready? Is dependent origination actually the cycle of samsara? Now, for literally centuries, the deeply entrenched traditional belief has been a resounding yes, that it represents this endless cycle of rebirth spanning across multiple lifetimes. But the analysis we're exploring today asks whether that accepted narrative is really what the original teachings intended. So this gives us a totally fascinating contrast in paradigms. On one side, you've got the traditional view, which defines dependent origination as a metaphysical cycle of rebirth across past, present, and future lives. But then, the author derives a completely different biological view, pulling this directly from the original texts of the Tripitaka. He argues that dependent origination is actually a biological and scientific life cycle, one that plays out in a single physical existence. I mean, talk about a major paradigm shift, right? To really wrap our heads around why the author proposes this shift, we kind of have to look at his specific logical critiques of the accepted status quo. First up is the structure itself. In the chain of dependent origination, death is the final link. So the author argues it's just logically impossible for a rebirth link to occur before the death link in that very same chain. Makes sense, right? Second, he points out that this whole multi-life cycle interpretation relies heavily on Buddhaghosa's much later commentary, the Visuddhimagga, and not the original Tripitaka texts. And third, that popular visualization we all know, the continuous wheel of rebirth, he notes that's mostly supported by later temple murals, not the foundational words themselves. And that actually brings us to a foundational principle of the author's entire analysis. The quote is, "The Dharma is in the Tripitaka, not in the commentaries or sermon books." The source text argues that over the centuries, all these added commentaries and interpretations have made the philosophy unnecessarily complex, in fact, sometimes even contradictory. To find the real scientific reality of the teaching, the author insists we absolutely must strip away centuries and added layers and just return exclusively to the original source text. So, the truly crucial point here is how we define our terms when we actually go back to those original texts. The real turning point of this whole biological framework rests on redefining the word bhava. Now, traditionally, this is translated to imply some mystical rebirth or becoming in another realm. But the author? He looks at the context within the suttas and redefines bhava as the literal physical creation of new life. It's a biological beginning, not a metaphysical leap. Using this strictly biological definition, the text maps out dependent origination not across multiple mystical lifetimes, but as a three-part timeline of a single physical existence. Phase 1 is the past. Phase 2 is the present. So, this is the biological development from a fetus growing all the way into adulthood. And finally, Phase 3 is the end, which represents the biological realities of aging and near death. It is a highly practical, totally observable timeline. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is happening in Phase 1? The chain famously begins with ignorance, or avidya. Well, the author applies a really strict logical lens here. Think about it. Ignorance requires a functioning mind to exist, right? It can't just float around in the ether before a person is born. So the analysis suggests that Phase 1 actually represents our parents, or our ancestors. It was their biological drive and worldly ignorance that ultimately led to our physical creation. So how does all this build into the physical life cycle? Well, the author elegantly steps us through exactly how this biological chain functions. Step 1, upadana, or intense attachment occurs. Step 2, that deep clinging literally drives the creation of bhava, that new biological life we just talked about. And step 3, once that biological life actually exists, the completely inevitable physical realities of aging, decay, and death must follow. It completely frames dependent origination as a cycle of biological suffering that simply ends in death. Okay, so having firmly established this biological framework, the text then tackles a super popular modern spiritual claim. I mean, you've definitely heard people argue that the physical world around us is just a mental illusion, right? Or just some projection of our minds. But the question is, does this biological perspective actually support that? Let's take a look at how the author addresses the reality of our sensory experience. The author's stance on this is just brilliantly grounded. He argues that claiming physical things were made by the mind is like saying a car moves using the battery of its remote control. I love that. It's an incredibly relatable, common-sense analogy. He firmly rejects that extreme esoteric notion that our minds literally conjure the physical world into existence out of thin air. The physical world is real, folks, and our biological senses just interact with it. According to the text, we really need to understand the biological purpose of our five senses. They basically evolved for survival, meaning they have very specific biological limits designed to help us navigate the physical world safely. They were absolutely not designed for analysis. What I mean is, they didn't evolve to act like perfect scientific instruments to let us see the absolute quantum truth of every single atom. For example, if you hear a beautiful song, your senses don't need to analyze the exact audio frequencies, they just need to process the sound so you can enjoy it. Our senses are just practical biological tools, nothing more. And because we are fundamentally biological beings, the author points out something actually deeply comforting. We have natural, inbuilt mechanisms to prevent endless attachment and to help us cope with suffering, or dukkha. For instance, we naturally develop an aversion to eating the exact same food every single day. Or, we get tired of listening to the exact same song on repeat. And when we experience intense mental distress or major failure, our biology steps right in. We lose our appetite and our body literally forces us to rest. It's like our biology actively tries to break those endless loops of attachment. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that our physical existence and our senses, what's known as the five aggregates, are not the enemy. Just merely experiencing the world is not suffering in and of itself. The text clarifies that suffering only arises from clinging, from upadana. It's the psychological obsession, that desperate attachment to those sensory experiences that traps us, not the biology itself. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, wait a second, don't the ancient texts constantly warn against all worldly desires? Well, the author notes a really fascinating piece of historical context regarding this. He claims that 99% of the suttas warning about the extreme, fiery dangers of passion were directed specifically at monks. So these were highly specific teachings meant to maintain strict monastic discipline. They weren't supposed to be a practical mandate for everyday lay people living normal lives in the secular world. Therefore, the practical application of this biological perspective looks very, very different from ascetic monkhood. For lay people, the text outlines clear, actionable steps. First, it is entirely acceptable to strive for worldly, secular progress. Second, your daily practice should just be actively working on minimizing hatred and delusion in your own life. And third, you should replace those negative states by actively cultivating love, compassion, and importantly, scientific, open-minded thinking. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. If dependent origination isn't about escaping some magical cycle of future lifetimes, but is instead about the very real biological reality of this exact moment, how does that change things for you? How will you manage your attachments to break the biological chain of suffering today?